Hello and welcome to another edition of Trailhead Live. My name is Mohit. I'm a developer advocate here at Salesforce. Welcome to another episode of Modern App Development on Salesforce. In this episode, we're gonna see how to build custom experiences using Lightning Web Components. Now we'll get to the Lightning Web Components, but before that, we will recap a bit of what we sort of explored in the last few sessions. Also talk about Lightning design systems and design, before we get into this custom experiences. Hopefully, we'll get through all the content today, and if not, we'll definitely continue in our next episodes. Now, before I begin, there's a forward-looking statement here. Please do not make any purchasing decisions based on anything forward-looking that we make in this presentation. Again, my name is Mohit. I'm a developer advocate. I have my Twitter handles there, so feel free to reach out to me for anything that you would like me to provide an explanation for, or if you have any feedback, to reach out to me. Now, before we get started, let's see where we are in this modern application development on Salesforce. Again, just a reminder that in this series, our goal is to basically cover the full spectrum of application development on Salesforce, from design, build, testing, and packaging it. And it also includes Heroku because we feel that Heroku is part of our platform, and combining both Salesforce and Heroku, there's a lot of scale that you can add to your applications. So today we're going to talk about building custom experiences using Lightning Web Components. And again, as I said, a lot of the content will be on SLDS. In the beginning, I'm going to talk about design a lot. In fact, we're going to be having a guest. We'll have a product designer, Brian, joining from CarMax. So excited to get to that interview segment. But before that, we'll have to get through some of the slides here. And then in December, we'll have Julian back, and we're gonna be working on some Heroku content, some Salesforce content, and all of the content have been lined up for December and January. Okay, so let's recap a bit of what we were exploring in the last session. So in the last session, if I summarize to the slide, we're trying to, explore the various ways to build on Salesforce, right? So as you can see, you can use the Salesforce Builder tools, custom layouts using out-of-box components, custom components, of course, using Lightning design system, or you can go fully custom. Now, if you see at the bottom of the slides, it also shows the complexity level and the amount of code that will be involved. Now, if you decide to go fully custom, note that there will be high amount of code and there will be high amount of maintenance that you will need for your code, even after the application is sort of built. So when should we consider customizations, right? So obviously our first approach should be to see if we can achieve our layouts and functionality through low-code builder tools. If not, we should check out if we can use custom layouts and then use combinations of out-of-box components and maybe one or two custom components if you need. But if you still are not able to satisfy your requirements, that is where you go custom component. So there are a lot of out-of-box blueprints, as a foundation. So you should be using Lightning-based components to begin with. But that, let's say you need something really custom, then you can obviously, go complete custom. So that's the aspect that we're going to be exploring actually today. Again, design is a big aspect of that. And I want to make sure that we understand this whole concept of design from a designer's perspective. Although I feel like every Salesforce developer should know a bit of design, but design is a specific skill set. So we'll have someone joining us today. Brian from CarMax is going to help us through understanding what it means to be a designer working on Salesforce platform, and also how as a developer we can collaborate with designers, and how we can start working towards our design skills, improving our design skills. In fact, Salesforce provides lots of tools to help this, and we will definitely explore some tools today. And as we move along, we will see how to also prototype a bit. But before that, I want to put the slide around the best practices here, right? So it's always about, finding out the sweet spot. And that is, your desirability for your users, the viability, which will be your business goals, and then feasibility in the allowed amount of time. That's so important, right? I mean, you can go custom, you can build your custom code on Salesforce, but you should always ask questions around, okay, what are my requirements? What are my users, desirability, and what is the feasibility of that solution, and also the maintainability, right? So you have to find the sweet spot, and that is a bit of an art that comes up as you sort of work through or know a lot of tools that Salesforce provides around design, and also you explore different platforms, or you explore different capabilities of the platform, like our low code tools like Flows, App Builder, so you know what is possible out of the box. And then you also need to build a couple of components to make sure that how to build Lightning Web Components, and then also understand the amount of effort that's going to require, right? So you have to balance things. You have to balance between that, find sweet spot. That's a bit of an art that comes with a little bit of experience here. Okay, so now I want to take some time and talk about app design and prototyping. In fact, a lot of the content I pulled from a really good Trailhead module that I have as a link shared. So I'll share the links for those Trailhead modules. But really, it talks about app design and prototype. And I thought that even for Salesforce developers, it's pretty interesting to actually know those concepts. So let's talk through app design and prototype. So the first thing is whether you are building an out-of-box components and layouts, right, or creating custom components that you're designing, right, you are essentially using design. So you are basically designing, whether you're using out-of-box components and layouts or custom components, everything is called design. So you're designing. So there are actually two aspects to this whole design. For example, if you are familiar with Salesforce out-of-box tools, like App Builder, know the components that Salesforce provides out of box, you can just use Salesforce Arc itself to design and present your solutions or validate your solutions. So always it has to be an iterative approach. So you iterate upon your designs, basically. So if you are planning to use out-of-box components, right, really using Salesforce app builders and templates that Salesforce provides, it's a really WYSIWYG editor. So you basically use that, and you can validate your designs. And a lot of our admins and as a developers, we should be doing that, using the org itself to design. Now, the second aspect of it comes when you're actually custom creating something. Like, for example, you're custom creating your components or custom creating your layouts altogether. So for those kind of things, it's always better to sort of design it. And I'll talk about different stages of the design, but it's always better that you actually design it, using tools like Sketch. We provide you a plugin, so we are going to explore that plugin in one of our activities today. That's the Sketch plugin that we provide. So you should use some tool to actually sketch out your layouts, sketch out your components. You can start with just by using shapes, just by using something like Lucidchart or pen or paper. So you start with a sketch, and later on you move towards using low fidelity, and then move towards high fidelity using these tools. So we'll talk about that. But I want to make sure that you understand this, that if you directly code your solutions without sort of validating with your stakeholders, what happens is you will have to rebuild again and again. And building is expensive thing. Building something and then going back, tearing it apart, and then again building, it's a lot of work. And while you can use tools like Sketch to just present your layouts, and then once let's say your stakeholders are convinced, then you can use Lightning Web Components. And I'll talk about there also you try to sort of use base components, because they provide you a lot of functionality already before you sort of go and put your custom markup in place. Okay. All right, so what are some of the app design and prototype steps, right? So you basically start with a research. So essentially, you gather your requirements, you research upon them, you survey it, you play it back so that you have to make sure that you have understood your requirements. And this involves a lot of one-on-one interviews as well. So you start with the research. The next step here is you craft your story. Now, this could be, you use, pen and pencil and draw it on paper. You use, known shapes like squares and circles, and you whiteboard or, you use markers to actually craft your story, right? So once you do that, then you actually move on to your design tools. That is in Salesforce, right? We provide you a unified design system, lighting design system that all of, if you look at all of the Salesforce standard pages, they use the same design system. And, we have base components sort of, already available for them. So use obviously your web components can be built using Lightning design system, and then we provide you with tools like sketch plugins so that you can prototype something before you sort of start coding or building. And then also the last step here is to present the prototypes and validate, right? So let's say you're a developer, right? And if you have designers, I always recommend that before sort of building your components, always build prototypes, validate with your designers. If you do not have designers, validate with your end users and see how they are sort of feeling about the design that you have. And also reach out early, right? If you're collaborating with your designers, one of the aspects here is reach out to them early as a developer so that you guide them to produce designs which are very feasible. In my experience, I've seen that designers go their own way, and specifically if they're new to Salesforce, they go their own way and kind of they can come up with a very pixel perfect design, but at the end you might find out that it's very hard to actually build it up. So it's very, very important that you present the prototypes and validate. So that's a little sort of a slide on app design and prototypes. Now I want to move on to Salesforce Lightning Design System. So Salesforce Lightning Design System. So create experience for your enterprise, right? So the design system includes resources for you to create user interface with Salesforce Lightning principles, design language, and best practices. So as a developer, you can focus on your application logic, while designers can focus on user experience, interactions, and flows. And Salesforce sort of provides tools for not only, again, designers, but also for admins, developers, designers, consultants, and product owners. So all of the tools that we have, it's not just for designers. In fact, if you look at, the sketch plugin that we have, or the kits that we have for Figma, those tools are not just for designers. Even as a developers, you can really learn those tools and take it to your advantage to quickly prototype an idea. So let's move on to Lightning Design System website. In fact, I have the website link in the learn more about SLDS there on your screens. So you have the bit.ly URL that will take you to the Lightning Design Systems. So Lightning Design System, again, it's based on design fundamental principles, right? So there's design guidelines, you have tokens, you have blueprints, and then you have tools, right? So they have designed it such a way that, it's flexible, it's scalable and efficient and accessible. That's very important that, there's accessibility, meaning, everyone should be able to access it, irrespective of the device that they use. So they should be able to access the components or the UI. So it's also open source. So a lot of these things are built in open source, and also it's platform agnostic, right? That means you can use with any tech stack actually. You can use with Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visual Force. So you can use with any of these sort of technologies here. All right, so this is Lightning Design System, right? So let's spend some time looking at this website, because this website has a lot of good information. So one of the things I like about this is the design guidelines itself. So let's spend some time on browsing through this Lightning Design Systems website. So what we see here is basically it talks about the design principles on which this SLDS is based out of, like clarity, efficiency, consistency, and beauty. And then it also talks about the various builders and the configurations that you need. Obviously it has shows you different chart types, when to use versus other. So there's a lot of design guidelines for you, for your layout, for your localization, messaging, if you're building a search or navigation. So this is all design guidelines, which is really cool that it's all documented. Now we also have accessibility. So there are guidelines for accessibility, and then it goes into some of the patterns that you need. And then where it gets interesting is the component blueprints. So that is where you will find all the components and their blueprints. Now the blueprints also have code in it, but you'll find that for a lot of these blueprints there's already a base components. So if you actually go to Lightning components, so if you go to Lightning components developer guide, you will find that so this is the Aura component. So this is for Aura component, but let's say that you need one for Lightning Web Components. So this is the URL for the Lightning Web Components essentially. So you basically go to this website that is on developer.salesforce.com/docs /component library, right? So here is where if you go to component references, you will see a lot of, like, for example, we were looking into accordion, right? We're looking into accordion, and if you look at, there's a lot of code in it, but it's all sort of abstracted for you on how to work this in LWC. So that's pretty important actually. So yeah, this really is most of the components here have been sort of implemented. A lot of them might not be. So yeah, so basically the base components are using the component blueprints. So it's interesting. And then we have some utilities, like for example, let's say you need an alignment, or you need borders or boxes, so a lot of utilities actually. And these utilities are really handy if you go through them and understand what's available. For example, you don't have to struggle with padding or adding margins or positioning, because a lot of the utilities are provided here. And then we have this design tokens actually, which again, which really is very cool. And one of the functionalities that they've been working on is what we call it as hooks. So styling hooks are like really new concept, and essentially they allow you to like override the styles apart from what the Lightning design system gives, with your own sort of customized styling, right? So you can express your brand basically. So it's a beta feature essentially, and there's a lot of components that you will see that they already have these styling hooks. So that's something to to explore actually. So we have all of these, and again, I don't want to go into like real depth of Lightning design system. I know that there's a Trailhead live session that I'll link to from one of our colleagues here, Aditya. So he kind of went through this SLDS, how to use them in Visualforce, how to use them in Lightning Out, etc. In really depth. So I'll specifically link to that. But the core idea here for me was to just walk you through the thinking behind all of these and give you an overall bigger picture. So we have design tokens, we have obviously icons, and what today I'm so interested in talking about is tools. Now, designs like Lightning design system provides a lot of design tools. Now these design tools, do not think that these design tools are just for designers, but some of these tools are for admins or for developers, consultants, or product managers, right? So it's designed in such a way that everyone can benefit out of it, right? So one of the tools that I'm gonna explore today will be the Sketch UI kit, that gives access to the Sketch libraries. So we're gonna use that tool. Oh, sorry, we're gonna not use Sketch UI kit. In fact, we're gonna use this Lightning Design System plugin for Sketch. That's what we will use. That allows us to like prototype, and one of our activities today will be to explore this tool, how to install it. Now, this tool is only for Mac users, but let's say you have Windows, right? You should explore some browser tools. Like we have Figma UI kit actually. So Figma is again a well-known design tool on cloud. So explore Figma, and this Figma UI kit essentially it provides the same thing as the Sketch. So you can use that. So yeah, there are additional resources, and also there are some developer tools. Like for example, in our VS Code, we have this extension called SLDS Validator that validates whether the CSS that you are writing is compliant. It's compliant to the SLDS design system, right? So that's also interesting, and it's a valuable toolkit to have. So there are a lot of tools actually on this page that I think one should sort of explore even as a developer. Anyway, so we move on to our next section, and okay, so our next section is to do an activity. Again, just like the format of this series, we try to do some activity so that we are not just talking with the slides. We have some hands-on experience, and we have time to get our hands a little bit dirty. So with that, let's actually move on to our activities section. So our first activity for today is, so you've seen the eCars application, right? So we know how the current inventory page looks. It almost looks like this. We have, vehicles. We have, it's a list view essentially, which has the model, which has the package name. It has a VIN, right? We can add one more column here, status of the inventory, right? So this is the current design, right? But let's say the agents using this have expressed that it would be visually helpful to them if they can see the car images for each inventory. For them, the status field is not obvious, and they've asked us to make it visually appealing. So let's work through a Sketch mockup to see how we can improve the current experience. Okay, so we're gonna design. Now this is where like out of box thing can be improved, right, with a custom component. So let's design a custom component which, instead of showing this in a a list format like this, it's gonna show us in a different format that will be much more better experience than what currently we have. Okay, so with that, let's actually bring up your Sketch tool. So Sketch is free for Mac. So you go basically to Sketch tool, and you basically say Sketch tool download. So you go here, you can try it for free. So you just say try it for free actually, and yeah, try on your own. So you can download a trial. Basically, you'll get a 30-day trial. So you download that Sketch tool, and then so let's actually open that. I have the tool. So let me open the Sketch tool. So this is the Sketch tool. And the next thing you do is actually install. So you download this Lightning Design System plugin for Sketch. So you download that, and then you essentially click on the zip file. It'll unzip it, and it'll be sort of linked to your Sketch. So for example, I have it. So I can easily see that when I click on manage plugins, I see I have a Lightning Design System plugin by Salesforce. Okay, so now let's actually create a new document where we are actually going to design the component. we're gonna design the component essentially, and see how we can use that sketch plugin. So there's an easy command to actually bring up. So if you say Command J, it should pop up the plugin. So now if you look at this, right? So if you look at this, let's zoom in a bit here. Okay, so if you look at it, right, so you see, and you can say Command J, or you can actually essentially click on this plugins and say Lightning Design System plugin, and it brings this. So this has all the components that are sort of available, and you can search for it. Like for example, let's say I want a header, right? So I can search for it. I want a card, so I can search for it and see various cards, right? Various SLDS formats, right? So that way it becomes really very easy to drag and drop on the artboard. I'm going to come back to what is an artboard here, but yeah, so it's, again, for different devices, they have components, you have different icons, you have different builders, essentially, and then you have charts, you have user engagement, and then you have rules and filters. If you want to design some sort of filter, then this gives you a UI. And then there's a standard artboard. In fact, we're going to use this artboard for large desktops. So instead of like starting from the scratch, you can start with an artboard. And then we have the specs. So we have the specs here for, let's say, alignment or margin or spacing. And then we have wireframes, right? So for example, if you need just the wireframes, right? So you have the wireframes. Okay, so now we're gonna drag the standard artboard to begin with. So here's it is, right? So standard artboard. And one of the cool features that is provided here is to actually left click and say detach from symbol. When I do that, it actually breaks this whole monolith one sort of component into its individual pieces. Like for example, I can click on individual pieces and it actually hovers me through that, right? So for example, now let's say I want to change this name of this from, let's say I want to override this from sales to say Pulsar app, right? Or this is a Pulsar. Pulsar is a fictitious company again for e-cars that we use. Let's say I want to override and say showroom instead of, so I can override, like as you can see, right? Similarly, I can override the home component as well. So all that I need to do is actually kind of find out that, and then let's see what's going on. Okay, so all that we need to do is find that icon, right? Find that icon and essentially override it. So let's find that icon. So there are so many. I think the last one, there you go. So you find that out. Let's say I want instead of home, it will be inventory. So I override it. It's that simple, right? So now, so now what I'll do is I'll also drag and drop the components, right? So now I can drag and drop the components here. So let's drag a card component. So let's talk about a bit of design, right? So instead of list, I can give a card view, and I can have an image of the card there. That's more visual, right? And for the status, I can use a badge or something, a badge, right? So again, to understand like what you need, right, know all the out of box components that Lightning Design System provides, and then think through the requirement, just visualize it, and play with different combinations of those components, right? And maybe you first start with just drawing the boxes, drawing, again, use the circles and boxes and known shapes to begin with, and then once you sort of visualize it, then you start using your components. Okay, so now again, Command J to bring that the design tool. So where is it? Here it is. Okay, so now let's pull the card. Let's pull the card component. So I'm gonna choose all. It's gonna say card, right? So there are different types of cards again, right? Okay, so we want a simple card like this. Let's pull this. Okay, so I have my card, right? Let's actually give it a width of 390. Okay, so now I have the card. Now I also need the okay, so now all right, let's also pull in that badge. So let's say I have a green badge here, so I'm gonna pull that. I'll pull that. Right, let's say our badge value will be available. Okay, all right. Now we also want to add a header. Probably it'll be good to add a page header. So let's add a page header, which basically let's add a page header. Let's drag and drop. So again, you can change the header in this case. Okay, again, you can change the header. In this case, we just need to probably call this as inventory. So we change it. And let's also change. Yep. So again, what you can do is you can detach from symbol. So it actually splits up the stuff here, right? So, and then you can actually replace the icons. So for example, I want to go to icon library, and let's say I want another icon here, like for inventory, maybe I'm using a custom icon like this. So I can just choose that and that gets reflected. So it's that simple, right? Again, let's say I don't want this because this is not a record page. I can get rid of it. So it's that simple. So you basically just drag and drop. Now let's say I want to drop the badge component, right? So let's bring that up, bring the plugin, and then say badge component. Okay, I want to drag that badge component here. And I want to say badge value is success. Oh, sorry, available. Badge value is available, right? And then we probably need to expand this a bit. And let's say I also need a car image that's gonna go here. So I can, for timing, I can just insert a shape here. So I can go to the shapes. I can say a simple rectangle. Let's just use a simple rectangle here. This is where our car image will go. Okay. And then let's say, so this is where our car image will go. And let's say that, we use the bottom to write some text. So we can easily do that by just saying text. And then, yeah, so just say insert a text. So we basically say insert a text. Just insert, we type something and choose the black. Choose the black here. All right, so here, let's say our text, our model, our car model. Okay, so we then move this down here. So this is what a sketch tool sort of allows us to do. It quickly allowed me to, essentially create a mockup, right? Now, what I can also do to replicate this is just group these. Like, for example, I want to group this, for example, this, then this, then this. Command Shift. So you can select this, okay, so if you hold command, command shift. If you hold command shift, you can select multiple of them. So you can select like literally all of them here, and then say group. You can group selection and groups you. So that the next one that you need, you just drag the group. So there you go. Okay, we missed this. Okay, we missed this. But you get the idea, right? So we can easily sort of adjust it to whatever dimensions that we need. And let's say I wanted to change this, right, and add a different icon here, right, like an error. I can choose that, right. Maybe choose this one to say out of inventory, or let's say sold, right. So that's the whole idea of using a design tool or a prototype tool that we have. So the real advantage, as I want to say, is you get these these cool things right within your tool, so that you get all of these components right within your tool, so that you can easily drag and drop and create your create your layouts. And once you sort of create your layout, you can always export that as well. Okay, so what you can do is you can always insert an artboard here. So let's just insert an artboard. Now, ideally, I should have started with an artboard, but essentially, you can create an artboard. You can preview that. Like you can preview it, and then you can actually export that as well. So you can export to PDF or export to the PNG. So I can save this on my desktop. There you go. Yeah, so that's the power. Like without like writing any piece of code, you use one of these design tools to actually start mocking up your components, your custom components, and then you can share this with your team, get feedback, collaborate with your stakeholders, and get the feedback. And once you sort of finalize on the designs, then you can get on hands-on and build your application. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of how to use these SLDS sketch tools and prototype, let's actually talk to someone who uses this day in and day out in their job and in the field. So I want to welcome Brian from CarMax, and let's actually connect to Brian and talk to him about his experience around designing applications on Salesforce and how he has been using some of the tools that we talked today. Hello, hey Brian, welcome to Modern App Development on Salesforce. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a bit about the work that you do, Brian, at CarMax.
I'd be happy to. So I am a product designer with CarMax, headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. And my role, within our team is to help be, the advocate, both for our user and for our associates, who are the ones who are primary Salesforce users. So it's my great pleasure to be able to partner and work with our different teams, understand about the different needs that they have, and then help translate that into, well, how can we deliver that experience to our associates through the Salesforce platform?
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much again, for, helping all our developers here, because we want to understand how better we can work with designers here. So Brian, how is, developing on Salesforce, or let's say designing on Salesforce, really different than, designing on other platforms that you'd have worked?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've been involved with user experience and customer experience design for about the past 20 years. And it is a little different within Salesforce. Previous teams I've worked with where it's maybe more of a traditional web app development, you have a lot more flexibility because, developers are always saying, sure, we can custom build everything and we can kind of build things from scratch. And so over the past 4 years, having the opportunity to design and work within Salesforce, admittedly, there was a bit of a learning curve to
Hmm.
become familiar with the Lightning design system and understanding the different components. But what I've also learned is, how quickly we can then move. Being able to leverage things that maybe are already existing within Salesforce or maybe something we've already created. We're finding ways to, I think, help support our users faster. And so, I think once I got through, a bit of that learning cycle and
Hmm.
becoming more familiar with it, it's given me kind of a new challenge as a designer. But I've also been able to build some great relationships with our development teams too.
Wow, that's so awesome to hear. So I know that Brian, you've been using some of our tools that our Salesforce design team has been sort of working on it. Specifically, I heard that you use Sketch plugin a lot, like the Sketch plugin for SLDS to prototype the screens for Salesforce app. Could you talk us a bit about that, and how was your experience working with that?
Yeah, it's been a great addition to our toolkit. When I think back over the past few years, a lot of the concept work that I've done and the prototyping work, I've had to build kind of on my own, the different components and trying to replicate kind of how things may already exist within Salesforce, which took quite a bit of time, to step back and, look at how a card could be generated.
Hmm.
I was putting my own thoughts and I started to kind of occasionally would veer off course too.
Right.
And then that's something I'd have to then, kind of settle up with the developers on. What's been great about having the Sketch plugin and having all of those resources available, just it's a faster runway for us, and especially for me, where to be able to do a quick screen creation, and using existing components, it's not only allowing me to build faster, but it's also providing me more time to iterate. And so, within my process, it's not just coming up with the one idea and taking that forward. We want to explore, what's possible, and even try and challenge ourselves in how we think. So it's getting us, to having, I think, visuals that are much more obtainable and
Hmm.
ensuring that we're connecting to how things work today within Salesforce. Um, but then giving us opportunities then to move faster too.
Wow, that's so exciting to hear. So Brian, if I ask you like how much efficiency have CarMax sort of gained, using designers in combination with developers and using tools like Sketch, what would be your like rough guess or an estimate?
Um, well, I think there's been two areas, Mo, that I'm finding more efficiency in. One, it is kind of the speed to create screens,
Hmm.
where before, I may spend, I don't know, 7, 8 hours to, start to put together a different screen flow and having multiple screens connected.
Hmm.
I'm able to do that in maybe an hour or two now,
Wow.
and be able to get into a refined view. But I'm also finding greater efficiency in working with my developers too,
Right.
because we're able to share that information kind of in real time. But they're also then having more confidence in me as a designer because they see how accurate these design concepts are and are much closer to maybe what I was providing previously because
Hmm.
we're leveraging what's available within the LDS Sketch plugin.
Got it. Awesome. So I know that Brian, and this is my favorite question, because I've been debating a lot on this. Is like in Salesforce, right? You can easily build a lot of the screens using clicks and low code. Like we have flows, which provide these screen, flows where I can drag and drop and create a multi-page screen. I have App Builder, and if you have worked with like Communities product, we have Community Builder. So we have all these low code tools, right? And but then you can also like really customize it and make it pixel perfect using your own custom components. So my question to you as a designer is, when do you sort of actually use a tool like Sketch versus like low code builders? Are you as a designer also using some of these low code tools like App Builder to put together a design, or you're always on Sketch and use Sketch for your work?
Um, so for me, and I think it's a benefit of working with some great developers,
Yeah,
I do spend more time, using Sketch
Sketch.
and being able to create the visuals that way than maybe doing some of the low code development.
Right.
But I've known to get into Builder too. But I think what we found is, starting within Sketch, we can start iterating and concepting faster. Part of our process is then taking those ideas and concepts and mockups, and then I'll go into one of our contact centers, the associates that I'm primarily working with, and get their feedback and be able to do kind of some live testing with them, and then be able to bring back, the learnings from there, and then we'll iterate on that prior to maybe even moving into low code. So it's kind of where we found, we're getting a higher confidence in what we're building before we start even moving into a low code solution. But there is that great handoff too then of, well, great, now that we have these ideas, rather than maybe going pixel perfect, which is something I've done, in working with other teams and different web dev, solutions, the fidelity that we're getting out of Sketch is something that connects very quickly to a low code solution. So we're eliminating even some of that from our process too. And talking to some developers even last week, they were able to see things and interpret them faster, which is then getting even a higher quality with some of our low code solutions.
Wow, that's very interesting to hear. So Brian, one question I had was, how do sort of designers collaborate with developers and architect, specifically during, today's world, like when everything is remote, like what stage of planning you start prototyping, and how do you involve your architects and your developers, and how do you sort of collaborate there?
Yeah, it's something that I continue to learn, over all the years and continue to appreciate. But the earlier I can involve, our friends and family in development and architecture, the better our solutions become.
Right.
So, within our process, as we start to identify and evaluate an opportunity, I always involve, our technical partners. Most recently, I led a design sprint for my team, and we spent 5 days dedicated looking into a set of opportunities, but it was something that we did collaboratively. And admittedly, it's like all of us or most of us right now, it's still working from home, but we're able to, I think, explore through that process even, and to ensure, and I think it's what I'm always hoping for within the team, there's a shared understanding of why we're focusing on this. I want everybody on the team to understand and build empathy, for not only for our customers, but for our associates who are supporting them. So as we move into technical design, and as we're looking at solutions, they understand the why behind it too. And that then, I think, increases, their understanding of how we can create things, and even come back to me with better ideas.
Wow.
And that's something that I always love and I'll challenge the team. I'm going to give us some direction. I'm going to give us hopefully better insight into why. But I know the talent and the ideas that can come from our technical, side of the house. They understand the platform much better than I can. So we find this great balance of creating the connection to the user experience, to how we can build great things quickly within Salesforce too.
Wow, that's so awesome to hear. And this is probably the final question to you, Brian. And you might not have the exact answer, but I would like to hear your viewpoint. So, in your Salesforce Arc today, right? I know that CarMax is our biggest customers, and you use Salesforce for a lot of your business processes here. So, in your Arc, right? How many sort of Lightning components do you have, like in terms of percentage, versus how many of them you use like standard components? In your experience.
Yeah, and admittedly, Mo, I had to go, and I was thinking about this beforehand, and I talked to some of our development partners, and it wasn't like a hard number anyone gave me. But I know when we think about that process of understanding and making decisions, even around, should we use a standard object? Should we move towards custom? It's just something that we do naturally. And I think it's just part of how we've matured as an organization of, as I'm working through visual, we're looking at standard components and what might be available today and meeting with architects. But then we have, part of our process in getting the feedback from users of, well, does this give them what they need? Is this going to help solve that problem? And then we start evaluating, well, what would we need to do in order to then move to a custom solution? So it's kind of this, we think about some of the gray space sometimes where it's not, oh, well, we're just going to go build something completely new and start, from first line of code.
Right.
So how are we connecting that to ensure, that the underlying greatness and the goodness of Salesforce that continues to drive these experiences, but then how do we start tailoring that to our specific associate and customer needs too?
Wow. That's that's wonderful to hear, and I'm pretty sure this is a lot of learning, for me as a developer, and I'm so excited, for a company like CarMax, because they have designers, and a lot of times I know that a lot of companies, developers are designers essentially, specifically for a lot of large scale companies. But to Brian, it was like, really awesome time chatting with you and learning about all these tools. I hope that we learn a lot from you, even in the future. And thank you for being an awesome trailblazer here. I really appreciate your time here, Brian.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Mo. It's great to have a chance to meet with you and hopefully share some of our insights.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Brian. That was awesome. That was really awesome to hear from Brian. Okay, now I want to talk about Lightning Web Components and how every JavaScript developer now can code on Salesforce platform. Now, again, we're going to cover the fundamentals of Lightning Web Components, but to get to the actual coding, we'll get back in the next episode where I'll have Julian and myself. We both of us will try to live code this prototype that we just sort of built. Okay, so let's actually talk through. Let's actually talk through Lightning Web Components. So Lightning Web Components, first of all, are used across Salesforce to deliver modular components, well beyond what Salesforce Lightning Experience offers. So you can use Lightning Web Components in your Lightning Experience, if you're doing Outlook integrations or Gmails or snap-ins in your communities, as a Lightning out in your Visual Force pages inside your Aura components in your Lightning Flow screens. So as you can see, right? So we give you standard out-of-box capabilities, but then you can use Lightning Web Components to sort of extend our platform and override certain things, right? So that's the power. Now I also wanted to take one more slide here to talk about Lightning Web Runtime. Now this is upcoming. With this, right, we will be able to sort of open up the container for porting your applications, or let's say if you want to build a high performance application not only on Salesforce, let's say on Heroku or on your website, right? So you should be able to do that with a Lightning Web Runtime. So it's gonna be modular, right? And then like for example, you should be able to swap our services, like for example, like routing, Apex services that we have, right? On the platform, we provide you all those capabilities. But let's say you're building an application outside Salesforce, you should be able to use our Lightning Web Runtime to build that. And also, you should be able to reuse our components. You should be able to reuse a lot of, techniques that we have, like caching and navigations, etc. So let's actually talk through a bit about, web components in general, right? So web components have great interoperability. They are future-proof and they are backward compatible, right? So that's why we choose web components at the first place, right? So if you try to build something using web components, you will see that the code that you're writing, like you will have to repeat the same code and again and again. There's no abstraction on top of it, right? There's no compiler that's gonna simplify your code. So it's as you can see, it's standard based, but still you need a lot of code, and you will be repeating same code again and again. And that's where the Lightning Web Components comes into picture, because it is sugar on top of web components, right? So it's sugar on top of web components. So we give you capabilities like, you can declare an API property so that a child component can pass in the data, right? So when you're sort of rendering the component, you can pass in the data, right? So also you can make a property reactive, that is, one-way data binding, essentially. That is, whenever there's a change in the data, it reflects on the UI, right? So all those capability is added by adding a sugar on top of web components. That is Lightning Web Components here. So as you can see, this is the final slide, right? Where you saw in the first slide was just only web components. But on top of web components, we have LWC, and then we have a tight integration with Salesforce metadata, right? Which increases the developer productivity, performance, and the security. Now, this is very, very important, the security. So, we have Locker on top of it, which makes your components secure. That means two components from two different vendors, if they are on the same Lightning page, there's no way to sort of hack the data out of one component. Let's say there are two components. Component A cannot hack the data, right? So that's how we secure it. And there's a lot of other security vulnerabilities that are prevented by this Locker layer, right? So, and also, these components are accessible. They use our unified Lightning design systems that we talked about, and there's whole, instrumentation and developer tooling around it. And again, we provide builders, right? For example, design time, configurations. We decouple the data and the APIs, and we preload a lot of them. So yeah, really powerful. Lightning Web Component itself is a great technology. It's, again, future proof, backward compatible. At Salesforce, what we have done is we have sort of created our own compiler on top of these web components, which is the Lightning Web Components, and that is tightly integrated with the Salesforce metadata, so that you have developer productivity, performance, security, and accessibility, right? Okay, so with that, I want to leave you with some helpful references. Again, I'm gonna be sharing the slides on the chatter group. The chatter group URL is here. I'm also gonna type it in the chat now. So just feel free to use this chatter group. This is where we are sharing all our slides. It's on the Trailblazer community, so anybody can join. So here are some of the helpful references, right? So I talked about three UX specific Trailhead modules that are there on the Trailhead. So do you use them to understand, how to prototype, how to think through personas, etc. And then we also have some quick takes from one of our team members, Alba. So she explains concepts like shadow DOM, custom elements, and HTML templates, etc. Also, there is a Trailhead Live series or Trailhead Live session that was done by Aditya. He explains SLDS and takes you into different aspects of SLDS. Of course, there's also Lightning Web Components Specialist Super Badge, which is one of your requisite for JavaScript certification. But we're gonna get into code next episode, so we definitely want to take this. We definitely want to take the prototype that we built and actually convert into a Lightning Web Component. And we'll have Julian join us and walk us through, how we build these components, and we'll be live coding in the next episode. So cannot wait for the next episode, which will be 1st of December. Okay, so I recommend that you explore our sample app galleries, specifically the LWC recipes app. It has some really cool, Lightning Web Components. They are in small bite size, so it's very easy to understand, and there's no complexity there. So do reference them if you're a newbie to Lightning Web Components. And of course, we'll be coding live next episode. So this is the URL for the chatter group. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please do leave your feedbacks, on the chatter group or via the Twitter. If you have any comments, remarks, or questions, do reach out to me. Thank you so much. See you next time. Have a good day.